And I'm going to talk about this book today, and as Margaret intimated, it's an issue that is continuing to rage as the revolution contests the coup of 2021. And as I was finishing this book, I actually had submitted a version of it, and then the coup happened. And James Scott actually said, well, your anthropology just became history if you're not careful. And so he suggested try to think about the book as a way of making sense of the coup and use the coup to help make sense of the book. And so each chapter has a coup application, and digital ethnography, mostly because I wasn't there, with the same people who I work with for the participant observation aspect of it, to kind of tease out what they were doing during the actual coup moment and how some of the protest repertoires and general approaches to living life activism informed the uprising. So I'm going to talk about that activist challenge in a place such as Myanmar, talk about some of the intellectual or conceptual contributions. I'm going to then go into the ethnography itself to talk about how activists respond to the particular kind of forms of state violence and neglect that define this particular place. And then I'm going to talk about some of the particular political ontologies, like basically ways of understanding power and reality that are revealed through this action. So we can kind of think of the activists as a sort of hinge that allow us to see the structure of the post-colonial political economy and state, but also allowed me to get access to sort of grassroots perspectives that were difficult and somewhat elided during this moment of political liberalization, and that seems very far away. And people were not paying much attention to peasants and workers who were struggling to navigate this transition. Can't see my own slides very well, but
you could hit an X and get rid of that little box.
Is it possible to make this smaller? And then I think I should probably I minimize this too.
I think you might be just going to move the whole bar. Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. Well, we'll just go with this. So, as Margaret mentioned, I started off on this study in a sense even before the formal fieldwork period. And when I first moved to Myanmar in 2004, I had read many of the accounts of the country in which the place was described as a karaoke fascism, where people lived in silence. Those are the titles of 2 books about it. And so I expected big men with guns everywhere. And going through immigration was, pretty terrifying. I didn't think anything bad would happen to me, but I was afraid of getting in trouble and getting kicked out. And instead, I only faced pleasant or disinterested officials, some of whom laughed at my attempts to speak Burmese, which I was learning then. Throughout my year, I often wondered, where was this scary state? It seemed much more absent in the accounts that I had been reading, and that sparked a sort of interest in trying to pursue more sustained analysis of what was going on in this country. But of course, this is also a state which orchestrates a military coup. The Burmese people were not impressed, obviously, came out to the streets in their millions. At that period, there was sort of direct contestation of this illegal and catastrophic coup. The gentleman on the left who proposed the sign basically says, if a corpse is needed for R2P to enter, come shoot me dead.
Right, to protect.
Yeah, and the regime, unfortunately, obliged vis-a-vis those corpses. And the murdered children, burned villages, and mutilated protesters don't need to be recapitulated here, but they do continue today. One thing I wanted to highlight is the way that those mutilated protesters were used as objects of terror. According to an AP investigation, the junta was using bodies, leaving them in the street as a way to terrorize. Well, my colleague Nick Cheeseman actually found the opposite, that sometimes bodies were disappeared, removed from sight, undermining the ability to know exactly what had happened. So the sort of terror, presence, and absence mimicked the sort of state violence and state absence that I was thinking about so many years earlier. At this point, the uprising pivoted toward a less directly confrontational manner of protest, because going straight into the guns, as many did, and particularly in Magdaya, was sort of suicidal. So one campaign that I thought was particularly interesting is this boo campaign. Boo is the negating particle in Burmese that basically means no. You have a couple of examples on the screen of different versions of this in protest paraphernalia, including stickers and a cartoon. Now, how did this no manifest? So at one point, protesters or activists jumped to their death off the roof of the building in eastern downtown Yangon rather than give up their comrades. A general strike tried to restrict the flow of resources to the Huta. And then people also deeply embodied at a personal level this rejection, up to and including rejecting even their own healthcare. The head of UNICEF said that she had never seen people so hostile to the authorities that they would refuse healthcare that they needed. But the no was not just a rejection, it was also a different kind of a yes. And it's interesting because it's a play on a Burmese proverb, do you know that one? No. So it's kind of, I mean, it basically can be translated as if you carry no like a talisman against evil, if you say no to everything, you won't be poor even when you're old. It sounds better in Burmese. But the kind of thing I want to focus on is that this parable was originally pretty simple in the sense that it says in a place as precarious and dangerous as Myanmar, you need to reject everything, even the possibility of a yes, the possibility of horizontal solidarity with others. It reminds me a little bit of Ardeth Thongmoon's recent book on everyday survival in Myanmar, where she talks about destructive coping strategies, the way that because people are stuck in a sort of suboptimal equilibrium where they can't connect with others, they end up over the long run undermining themselves. So it's particularly striking. This parable, which usually pointed in one direction, was re-signified to mean something else. So this you have during the CDM movement, people who went on strike, but didn't just go on strike, but helped each other. So in this cartoon, you have the woman on the left say, "Hey, doctor." The man on the right says, "Ha, teacher." So they left their professions and they were giving watermelon and support to those who were protesting. And many Burmese writers have highlighted the sort of collective effervescence in the streets. Now, I want to linger on this parable, not just because of its re-signification, because of the ever-present potential of collapse back into the cynical nature of the parable. This distills the challenge of activism in a place like Myanmar. Nothing's ever re-signified forever. There's always the trace of the haunting of the thing that came before it. Activists have to think about both those things at once. So to distill this into like easier terms, one of the things I was asking is how do people resist in contexts where they don't have any rights to secure their incursions into the public space, especially when head-on resistance looks like annihilation, and when the sovereign itself is somewhat illegible. This goes back to that point about where is the state that I was trying to find, and as with the parading, but also disappearing of bodies. So if we can use a schematic metaphor, this is a sort of vertical challenge, problematic as it is, where people in the grassroots are trying to get the state to do things differently. If the state can be imagined as being up here. There's also a horizontal challenge from people who, as in the blue parable, have been conditioned to see conditions as relatively normal or just the way things are, commonsensical, to see them differently, to see them as political choices that can be intervened in. So activists kind of have to think two different spatial scales at once. And this observation tries to motivate a sort of theoretical contribution into resistance studies, where I think it highlights the way that classic resistance studies are a little bit lacking. I hope it's not too silent to take shots at Jim Scott, who tends to presume a stable, legible class of people who are being oppressed and hence are ready to come when they're called. It also tends to presume a stable, legible object, the state or the dominant class to protest against. But in Myanmar, we see the state exhibit a radical presence and absence. So the presence is quite obvious, in keeping with what we know about authoritarian states, neoliberal reterritorialization, perhaps an overly fancy way of saying land grabs that even intended the liberalization period of the transition, in which land became a commodity and hence more valuable than as for what it was than what the peasants, farmers were producing on it. Sovereign exception, including coup, and racialized differentiation up to and including genocide of the Rohingya people. But also this radical absence. It will not respond to farmers' complaint letters. Its agents will tell protesters to finish up cloud protests quickly so as to not make a scene. And it will not rearrest a protester when she takes off her shirt and burns it in a court combat. So this woman, Sansan, had just been convicted of 54 months in prison for holding a nonviolent protest during the supposed period of liberalization. And rather than allow that to be the last word, she kind of pried back open the sort of contentious cycle and before being carted off to prison, burned up her shirt that said rule of law. One thing that was kind of interesting is that as she did it, she yelled, "Victory has been achieved, umbi, 3 times." It's a kind of interesting commentary in that as it stayed with me trying to make sense of what does it mean to declare something a victory that might seem to be a failure. I might look back to that at the end if I remember. But this absence isn't just the sort of explicit coercive arm of the state. It's also what we might call in the literature the governmental or biopolitical apparatus. So the more regulatory form of the state, in which this is the kind of state that would have administrative forms, but rarely use them, have ethnic classifications, the famous 135 ethnicities, but not know them, endonyms mixed with ethnonyms, the Salon and Austronesian people are categorized under the Pamama, in this sense. It's basically a sort of comedy of categorical errors. It will have ID cards, but it doesn't really insist anyone carry. The 2014 census revealed that 30 to 40% of people don't even have access to these cards. And on these cards are those sort of racial ethnic classifications. But people, when they're actually asked, what is your name, will often say things that don't fit the categorization very well. They'll sometimes say, they'll say, I'm a Buddhist race. Now, as an anthropologist, I find that to be completely normal, make sense. People can classify any way they wish, but we usually assume that authoritarian states have a monopoly on categorization itself, right? They put down the forms, they insist that people identify with them, and there's a sort of semiotic loop in which people come to identify with the categories in which they are regulated, but not in Myanmar, where people are kind of able to do it their own way, which I think is something that hasn't been stressed enough in the literature. And this is the kind of state that will give over certain state functions to right-wing political religious organizations, so particularly the group of right-wing monks who want to police inter-ethnic and inter-religious marriages. So putting them together, this is the kind of state of genocide and stage a coup, but also kind of disappear from grass. This means that it requires a particular kind of engagement. So I argue that activists must mimic the state's own oscillation between presence and absence. Activists must never be completely absent, either as abandonment of space, but also as sort of subjective quietude, and I'll come back to what I mean by that. But nor can they always assert presence, because that would be suicidal against a sovereign power that doesn't really care for the rights to govern. This is where I introduced refusal, which has been theorized in various genres of academic literature in the last decade or so, in indigenous studies and Black studies and some of these books here. Because it recognizes the inseparability of the sort of subaltern subject from that field of power, sort of pace the classic resistance theory. But as a result, refusal does not just entail subjects, consciously and necessarily efficaciously navigating those power fields from the inside. Activists are kind of aware that they could be captured by them and, interpolated, resubjectivized, tricked into identifying with their oppressors. On the other hand, flight is also not a privilege available to all, so you can't really just exit the scene. This is the trained struggle that has to be engaged. So at one point at the start of the book, the activists are considering leaving to the border, and then at the end it's revealed that they never actually leave. They do try to stay If they had left, I don't know if this would be a complete betrayal because there is this sort of coming and going that's available now, but it is telling that the people I work with decided to not give up the city and continue to fight inside the country. So as a result, it entails a necessity of maneuver or negotiation of that broader apparatus of power. So one of the things that, you know, we might call the day after the protest problem, right? When you go to the protest and you feel like you know who you're protesting against, and the next day you're back to the dailiness, the sort of challenge of organizing, the challenge of managing diffuse structures of power that don't always get focalized into a state. This is the challenge of this in Myanmar as well, where you can't, most of the ethnography was not me going to protests and prisons and courtrooms, although those are pretty interesting aspects of it. Much of the work that the activists that I trace do is that sort of supportive, mobilizing work at the level of getting populations to survive the neglect of this particular kind of state. Now, coming back to that point of subjective quietude, refusal must be processual or semiotic. You can't merely retain sort of like resistance in your heart because of the way that resistance or refusal, any of these things are necessarily semiotic in the sense that they create signs that other people have to interpret for them to be worthy of their name. So a refuser's opacity cannot be so great that the refusing subject dissolves completely. The distance can't be so vast. The turning away from power can't be so great that you cease to trouble that apparatus that you're actually refusing. Otherwise, it's kind of undifferentiable from pacification because you're sending out signs to others that will be read by them as acquiescence. And in this sense, as with the Boo parable, saying no to everything, turning away too far becomes almost autophagic or self-devouring, can be undermining the potential of what these folks are up to. So as a result, I try to theorize a resistance refusal practical dialect. I made that name, assumption. Where resistance is direct contestation in order to presence the state, get it to show up, provide a model for others to see an alternative articulated. But refusal is all that other stuff that happens in the penumbra of resistance, navigating the administrative state, enduring, mobilizing, waiting, rehabilitating, planning, evading that happens in the shadow of direct contestation. So what do the activists do in this sort of mobilizing aspect? They try to mobilize a domain that exists outside of political society. So part of the chatting that there's on the left says we need to get away from thinking about people who are regulated in the post-colony as having, you know, individual rights and having votes and thinking through the paradigms of classic civil society. And he says, most of the time people operate in political society. His term for those populations who mobilize as such, as groups of people rather than as individuals, and often in the space of the exception rather than the formal domain of liberal politics. But what I want to add to this is subjects in Myanmar are both not necessarily, clearly not presupposed as rights bearers, but not even really as population groups as well. They almost fall outside of that realm of political society. It's hard to get their signs to signify. They'll send letters to the state and the state won't send those letters back, a particularly maddening kind of you could say refusal by the state to recognize these population groups. So what activists have to do is get them to constitute themselves as groups. Here's how you can create a farmers group in your local area to try to keep your land back. Here's how you can constitute yourself as a workers group to try to argue for better treatment. And staying with the biopolitical point, they take over the sort of promotion of these populations to improve their lives. So on the bottom here is a free funeral society in which one of the examples of places that activists start, not by going to the streets, but by doing sort of basic service delivery, where they learn a lot more about people's daily struggles and they learn to connect with them on a daily level rather than merely in these sort of episodic eventful moments on the streets. Okay, so I've kind of alluded to what activists are doing, but I want to spend a couple minutes talking more about specifically their what they do. So 2014 and 15, I spent a year working with a group called Movement for Democracy Current Force. and sometimes it was called community development initiative, kind of very different things. One was directed more at what we might call resistance, the sort of causing trouble in a good way, and the other was mostly focused on developing and supporting communities. When I first met one of the leaders, I asked him, I was trying to make sense of this word force in Azu in Burmese. I asked him whether his party was, his group was a political party or an NGO, and he looked at me quite dryly and said, "We are force." I couldn't help but laughing eventually, and luckily so did he. But it was an interesting, or I think an important point that he felt even during, and others, his comrades felt that during this liberalization and the sort of capture that comes with the formalization in log frames and conference rooms, there was still a lot of space necessity for work with the community and work in the street. So what kind of work was this? These groups were ecumenical in regarding their defense of the marginalized, much like Don Juan was said to be loyal to one paramour is to betray all the others. These activists felt like to be loyal to only one particular struggle was to ignore all the other ones going on in the country. They moved around the country from rural struggles, particularly in Skye and Mandalay, where much of the current uprising is occurring, to industrial zones outside of Yangon, to peri-urban areas of Yangon where people kind of struggle in their daily life. Now, as activists, they embodied a social type that is legible in Myanmar. So the same way that you or your children might be asked what do you want to do when you grow up, and you can say baker or a doctor, you could say you want to be an activist in Myanmar. And unfortunately, because of the many decades of necessity of being an activist in Myanmar, that's a sort of legible social type. And one of the key rituals of rites of passage that one who is an activist must go through is spending time in prison. Many of the activists didn't feel like we really knew, could really trust someone until they had done their time. Not because, well, mostly because it's a sort of existentially challenging situation that no one knows how they're going to deal with until they come out of it. But because almost everyone did have to go to a prison, they weren't a doctor or a baker, and hence they kind of fell out of many of these life cycle kind of progressions. Many of them didn't have families; they were in prison instead, and as a result, they kind of became interesting, like liminal subjects. I often wondered why the protesters were able to have their own wards the prisoners, the political prisoners had their own wards, and they said, well, the regime didn't want us to infect the normal prisoners, so they kind of gave them their own spots. So they had all this like deep, intense solidarity with one another, but they were kind of cut off from everyone else. That sort of challenge many of them face after leaving prison too, where they struggle to try to connect with people. And much of the work done by the activists I traced was trying to solve that problem through service delivery initially, that then you politicize people by reminding them this is not the way exactly. So they had to forge relationships also with the ones that they were defending that were non-transactional, where being a weza or a broker in Burmese is considered pretty exploitative and opportunistic. But at the same time, how could they fund their activities if not from somewhere? In a corrupted political economy, it's dangerous or potentially self-betraying to have relationships with people with a lot of money. Then a lot of the ethnography in the book is tracing how these lives played out and how they navigated some of these tensions and conundrums. So what were the activist practices? They had to be willing to protest, to be arrested, to be beaten, to go to prison, very bodily activities, which helps, I argue, explain how they were able to make these incursions in the first place. You cannot evoke and invoke your standing as an unmarked, third-person citizen in Myanmar. You can't say, I have the right to do this because I pay my taxes, kind of way that one might mobilize their citizenship in America, for instance. that wouldn't get you very far. Oops. And instead, they have to use their own bodies rather than those rights to ground their activities. And what I mean by that is they can perform the intimidation of local level officials and then basically get them to call for backup, at which point in the sort of gap they can do their sort of protests. They often will point to the semiotic changes their bodies themselves make, sometimes the literal protest chains saying, look at these scars, I got these when I was in prison. There's something you can do to me, little boy, that hasn't been done to me before. At which point the local official will, probably stand down. But while this sounds pretty darn macho, and they do threaten and intimidate, they also bargain, cajole, tease, and beg many different protest repertoires, because you have to figure out, as they would often say, you have to identify the situation and what might work. One of the things I spent a significant amount of time tracking in the book is the way they use the esoteric realm to intimidate and shame. Here, activists are dressed up as in Lebanon, one of the places in the Sagaing region that became a hotspot of contestation of a Chinese military and Myanmar military-owned copper mine project that evicted people from their land. They dressed up as the spirits of the land to come judge who was the rightful owner of it, who would be condemned to 500 lifetimes of hell. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that you kind of had to evade or reject or refuse secular institutions. You couldn't take them to court. That would serve you very well. And by invoking a sort of cosmological justice system, you're actually almost reproducing a similar kind of legal structure, right? They're not only cursing the people who stole their land, they're saying, come judge us. If we're making stuff up, we're going to be subject to the curse. In that kind of interesting way that they step outside of the explicit secular realm to reproduce kind of interestingly similar logics. Kind of saying and expanding temporal scales into the beyond this lifetime. They can say, you may steal the land, you have more power than us in one way, but you may never remove the curse. So here's another one of these. This was in downtown Yangon. As they try to make the state legible, demanding a response, it also operates again horizontally to communicate to observing publics both, how they can intervene and how to intervene. So one thing I want to focus on here is just how much text is involved in Burmese protests, because they're trying to explain, trying to justify to not the military state as much as maybe their own future comrades, this is why we're doing it. One other little note here is I was wondering where they found these amazing photos of ancient demons and ogres, and they said, oh, we just Googled ogre. This is the scariest ones we found. So, improvisational tactics abound. Okay, so if that's, first part was kind of on the state and the apparatus, and the second part there was on the activists. This third part's going to be kind of on more like the people. What kind of political idioms mobilize the people? How do they think about power? So one time when I was asking Botol to describe to me, what do you do when you first go to meet the villagers? He said, well, the first time I go, I can't say you will protect your rights. If I talk that way, they will drive me out. Who is this guy? They will say. Now this was, on one level, kind of surprising to hear about a place like Myanmar that had been so completely, or at least on one level, inducted into the kind of global human rights regime. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, human rights became, with Fukuyama and history, this way of kind of this new political ideology. And Aung San Suu Kyi, for instance, was very willing to be incorporated into, yes, here she is, that particular symbolic milieu. Here we have Bono and his consonants used to hand out, what do we call this? Faces of hers. People can kind of wear, and he wrote a song about her called Walk On. One of the other thing that made this surprising is that I often heard, quite prevalent discursive endorsement by Burmese people about human rights. So when I was doing field work on the border, what I might call exile and elite Burmese activists, not the ones that I was really working with, told me, we are working for the human rights of all Burmese people. Our organization exists to tell people that they have human rights. And this was not what I found when I was doing research on the inside. They were working for the revolution, for the daily lives of people. And I, at that point, was curious about why such a difference. Now, on a certain level, it was pretty obvious. As Jim Scott has long reminded us, people who are living under the thumb of oppression don't have the freedom to describe things the way that they would want to. So it's quite possible that a parsimonious explanation would say, well, people on the inside would endorse that too if they had the freedom to. But I spent enough time doing, or I was lucky enough to do ethnographic research in these spots that made me think that maybe more was going on. Particularly people on the border were saying things like, I didn't feel like I was a full person until I learned about human rights. And rather than mobilizing human rights instrumentally, going back into the country and connecting with the sort of idioms that were available, it was an ambitious pedagogical project in which they were trying to translate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into pamphlets in Burmese that they would hand out to thousands of villagers across the country to try to build a human rights consciousness. So I was thinking maybe there were two different kind of communities of practice developing, one that was more interpolated and incorporated into a global cosmopolitan human rights consciousness, and one on the inside that maybe saw things different. And this became particularly clear when I started to ask about rights themselves, which only happened, as most things in anthropology, through luck, where someone said something that at first seemed quite crazy, and then over time I kept coming back to it. And she said, she's the head of an NGO. I was asking her about human rights, and she said, well, you actually have to focus on rights themselves, because we don't have them in words. If you're invited to go to a training or something, you will use opportunity. You will say, I have a right to go to the training. I think in the West, you would only say opportunity, no. But this is because the separate Western concept of right does not exist in our culture. It's been used a lot in the exile groups, and people have heard it, but people don't have the concept. So the average person sees human rights as a political word, they don't really want to study about it. So at this point, my red bells and whistles, whatever, alarm bells, that's it, go off in my head, because as in training, I was being trained as an anthropologist, we went through some pretty unfortunate linguistic colonial style racism in which something called the Sapir Whorf hypothesis presumed that if people didn't have a word in their language, they didn't have really the capacity to think about it, and hence it led to really nasty things like, well, you don't have democracy, hence you don't deserve democracy, hence we need to colonize you and eventually teach you about something like democracy. But I didn't want to do that. So I was very careful to not jump right into her conclusion, but at the same time, I thought, pretty interesting, what would it mean about power if this concepts that we keep, that in my language, we keep separated, rights and opportunities, were braided together so tightly in the linguistic expression and perhaps in their experiential expression that they weren't described differently. What would it mean to only have a right if you had an opportunity for it? So I started to develop a corpus, which is one of the things one does in linguistic anthropology, to try to figure out how are people actually talking about Akuriye and other cognates. And you can find pretty I think it's fair to say that Akuriye does point in both directions. It can be translated as rights or opportunities depending on the context. If you have Akuriye, that's human rights. If you have Akuriye, that's worker rights. But if you have Akuriye, that's opportunists. Shui Akuriye, the golden opportunities. So they're definitely pointing in those two different directions. And this was strange, and so it made me ask, what exactly is going on with right in general? This is a notoriously difficult concept to define, especially because if I had been using it, I am using it unreflectively. It's hegemonic. It moves behind our backs because we don't think about how it could be different. And so I started to develop a sort of focus on how people talk about rights in both casual and technical use. They can mean an aspiration. It would be right that, or it would be a right that. It could be a moral demand. It is a right because it should be. It could be a just dessert. It has been earned through some sort of labor. Although I guess that would be a delicious thing you eat after dinner. I don't mean that. It's a little typo there. And then of course it could be a quasi-legal statute. It is right because law says so. Also focus here on the interesting slippage between noun and adjective. One thing to be right versus to be all right. Not all languages have that. Burmese doesn't. The word for something to be right or correct or moral are different than the word for all right, or what we might say is all right, which is more like permission. So this guy on the right here, on the right, who's actually on the left, is interested in the structure of the demand, how right actually works. And he says rights are rights because they should act as trumps over political imperatives. They act as a firewall or a bulwark against certain incursions, which act as sever or foreclose politics, where politics are defined here as discursive or literal battles over normative ideals and the distribution of resources. So to give an example, like if I think that certain egotistic billionaires should be rounded up and shot Bertolt Brecht style, some people might support that as generally good for common humanity, but a rights paradigm would say, no, you can't just round up people and kill them just because you think it would be better for the world. And Boyce thinks that's generally, maybe not that example, but generally thinks that rights foreclose interesting and important political conversations. But in the dominant liberal framework advanced by someone like Ronald Dworkin, we tend to think these are pretty good things. So I'm belaboring this point because it allows me to advance my favorite pun in the book, which is rather than taking rights seriously, in Burma, rights are taken and quite seriously. So what do I mean by that? In Burma, things seem different, and how so? We got to go back to the cartoons, as always. Here we have a gentleman on the right who says, I'm not the kind of person who takes everything. He is a bag of equity there. He said, I left something for you. And the thing he left behind were dagon or duties. What I want to focus on here, again, going back to those sort of linguistic aspects, is the way that these things are nominalized. Rights are understood not as they are in Dworkin, as inalienable possessions that you can possess even when you don't have them. Instead, when rights are lost, Burmese people don't talk or I think about them the way we do inalienable possessions such as arms and mothers, still possessed after dispossession. So what do I mean by that? So let's say on the way here, I get my arm cut off in a terrible accident. And I'm still committed to doing the talk. In a certain sense, that arm isn't really mine anymore. It's laying on the pavement outside on Lafayette Street. But in the way that we describe this through our language, we use the personal pronoun my to describe things even when we don't have them. My arm was left on the sidewalk. My mother is fine, a wonderful person, very healthy. But if she perished, she would still be my mother, even though she's deceased, even though in some sort of material sense she doesn't exist anymore. So this is a sort of structure of what's called an inalienable possession. And Paul Koppelman, as a linguistic anthropologist, says that even in languages like English that don't have explicit grammatical markings of those particular possessions, you can figure out which ones are inalienable and which ones aren't. So these things are presupposed and constantly discussed. So to say the woman who has a head sounds weird to us because we presuppose that women have heads. We just get on with it in the language. We don't need to add that to the common ground before we start talking about the head, because heads are pretty darn important. They tend to be discussed a lot, so they get continually reinscribed into our sense of what it means to be a person. The woman's head was on fire, right? We don't need to say the woman who had a head that was on fire. There's a lot more words. So you might be able to see now where I'm going with this. The woman who had rights kind of sounds strange in a Western context. It hits our ear in a strange way. But the woman who's fighting for her rights sounds completely normal, even though she's fighting for something she doesn't have. Her possession, she doesn't literally have it at that moment. I mean, as the BC Boys remind us, you have to fight for your right to party. It's your right to party, even when you don't have it, which I know is kind of a silly example. It's a laugh line, feel free to chuckle. But it does reveal something strange about inalienable possessions and the way that we relate to them, or the way that I think rights fits into that paradigm. So my antenna went up for thinking about looking at the way people talk about rights. There's Judith Butler, famous philosopher, and she talks often about the way that rights are possessed even before they are, or even performed into being. She talks about people claiming their right of assembly by taking to the streets, or their right to gather in the case of Syrian rebels. Now, Jacques Rancière, who's clearly expressed in my critique here, uses similar kind of language, talking about how we have rights that we don't have. Now, I want to kind of like pause here that the performativity theory that these philosophers and many others embrace is actually pretty cool, because you know, sometimes performatives do work, a sort of version of faking it until you make it. You can perform into existence things that you didn't have before by presupposing that you already had them. That's kind of interesting. But on the other hand, these philosophers, I argue, tend to only move in one direction. They tend to think that once you have a right, you can never really lose it. But as we know from unfortunate political events recently, you can lose rights, even if they're yours, as the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court reminds us. And so what happens, I'll come back to this at the end, but what happens when we have a right that we don't have? What does that do to us as persons? Okay, so in Burma, because governance apparatus and average Burmese people never stabilized into sort of contractual forms describing standards of care to which subaltern folks have legible and predictable entitlements, which is a sort of long way of saying rights. Rights remain alienable possessions. They can be carried off, as you saw in the cartoon. They can be stolen. They can be looped. They can be, grasped. And one person can get snatched. One person can get more rights than another person. They're nominalized in a sort of strange way, different than they are imagined in the West as a sort of what the field of economics would call a public good, non-rival or non-excludable. So think about things like clean air or national defense. So I can't prevent Margaret from being defended by the national defense system, right? It's non-rival. I can't exclude you from it. And it's non-rival in the sense that if you're breathing clean air, it's not affecting how I breathe clean air. Now, this is kind of how I think we think about rights. People can enter the roles of rights-bearing subjects, and they're not really supposed to impact one another. But in Burma, it's much more of a zero-sum game when people will tell me, well, I get my rights, you might not get yours. And so they're kind of accessible only to those who perform adequately. They emerge only if there's an opportunity for their realization. So given this context, rights gets re-signified. And I don't know how much you can see of this. It's not too obscure, so I'll go through it. It's one of my favorite cartoons that I think mimics the semiotic process involved in how we have to reinterpret signifiers as we experience them. So the teacher is saying, she's teaching the students about human rights. She says, let's say it 3 times. Every person has the right to security from harm. In the second panel, because this is Burma, the bullets are coming in and she yells, crouch under the bench. So the third one, she tries to return to the initial period, but the situation has changed. The children have now interpreted their this claim through their own material experience, and instead of saying, what are human rights, they say, well, crouch to the bench. So if you are told you have rights, but those rights are not realized or enjoyed, how many times and in what kind of ways must that kind of performative fail before you see that failure not as an exception or as a mistake, but as a reflection of reality itself? How many times must the rule be broken before it breaks and cannot be put back together? So I argue that something like a quintier has a spectrum. It can mean as little as an opportunity, as much as a right, but because people have heard it, interpret it based on their experience on the ground, they see it much more as an opportunity. Now, this depends on your class position and your racial privileges and your gender, and that's why it's kind of interesting to do the field work to figure out who's thinking what about this. Some people will say, oh yeah, a quintier is basically just like opportunity, it's never a right. We don't need to experience those. And rich people will often say, oh yeah, there's no problem with rule of law in our country. It's like, wow, easy for you to say. Okay, so now we can bring back this block quote about rights and opportunities, and it starts to make a little bit more sense, and I can feel, and I hope you agree with me, that it's not the linguistic racism of the past and more a sort of point of entry in understanding how power works. So then to focus on the title of the book, we can see how rights are refused in 2 senses. Rights as material entitlements are certainly denied to Burmese people by the state, for instance. But Burmese people also, I argue, refuse rights as idioms for structuring claims. Activists, as we saw with Otto, reject them as potentially undermining their project. He doesn't want to be run off. marginalized people will refuse them as a false promise that exposes them to risk. And to go back to the difference between refusal and resistance, a rights claim is pretty darn direct. You know, it's deontic. It says you must do this. And idioms and political idioms in Burma are more often to be what's called epistemic modality. Wouldn't it be good if you did this? Wouldn't it be nice if we had a ruler, a state that took care of the people rather than ignoring them? That's like a different way of structuring the kind of. It's became quite clear to me at one point late in the research when a Myanmar Muslim activist was criticizing another who spent most of their time in Geneva talking about international human rights. And this Muslim activist said, if a beggar child demands something, you won't give it. But if he's cowering in the corner, you take pity on him. We are the most discriminating against the minority in the country. We can't be so aggressive about demanding things like rights. Now, one of the questions is this immobilized? Does it leave the beggar in the corner forever to be the beggar in the corner? Is it a sort of failure of imagination? And I think what I would argue is that there's a potential transformation of this beggar in the corner to continue the metaphor, but just not through a rights articulation. That could expose you to more risk. So are rights then completely unuseful, or a Quinnier rather? I think it doesn't contain the power of a trump. It's more of a counterclaim or assertion, suggestion against a particular way things are. We can understand the Quinnier in this always aspirational sense, made possible only by opportunities to realize. And so the activist and political task becomes to create the opportunity to change the conditions such that a right or an opportunity could be realized. Okay, so I've gone on for a while now. I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes, but then I want to do this sort of after thing where you go to someplace, you find something that seems really weird, and then you try to make it seem a little bit less weird. Then you bring it back to the place that you think is normal, where you're from, and make that place seem weird to itself. In other words, can the things that I claim insights we can see in Burma help us understand the weirdness of rights in a place like America? So for those in the West who think they have rights, might something be gained by recognizing that rights don't always work the way that they appear to? Can something be gained by giving up on rights? First, what's so wrong about them? I'm going to talk about two different forces, one of inflation and one of diminishment that happen at the same time. So this is Costas Tasinas, who's the legal theorist, who's very emphatically saying that there's an inflation of rights talk in the West. As soon as a new potential right is articulated discursively, it doesn't necessarily need to be realized. And I think that we can understand why that gap can persist because of this weirdness of inalienable possessions. Once we have them even if we don't have them, which is paradoxical, but that's kind of the point. Once it's claimed, it enters into our sense of personhood, another inalienable right that we have. But what happens if we check with the actual material realization of that? When the protesters leave, when the polluting coal plant gets built, despite the fact that we're protesting against it. So even as more rights are claimed, there are realities in which we don't achieve them. There's this other force that's existing at the same time, biopolitical application and political economic erosion, with someone, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. With the transition for white men from Fordism and welfarism in the 1950s to flexible regimes of accumulation that define today, a phrase of David Harvey's, fewer people can meaningfully participate in the market. They can realize their rights in a diminished way, and they become sort of losers as political candidates remind them. Now, while America's brand of neoliberalism diverges from Burma's, America's is increasingly defined by that abandonment, such that non-producers are symbolically and socially devalorized. So putting these two forces together, there's a sort of symbolic inclusion and material extrusion. And failures to realize rights of practice that are guaranteed in discourse, I argue, results in a weird splitting of the person into two. The ideal rights-bearing self and the degraded one trying to, wait or be restored to the former. It kind of provides a weird kind of alienation. So the question is, can we give up on rights? And it's hard because they are so constitutive of ourselves as persons. It would be like giving up on heads and arms and mothers. And that's one of the tricky things. I think it's an open empirical question. To what extent can we not rely on these things that maybe are not doing as much work for us, but they structure our symbolic world so deeply in our sense of self that they are what, kind of the play on Gayatri Spivak's line about liberalism. There's something we cannot not want. Okay. I'm going to skip forward and talk about the final lessons from activists in the coup context. So Burmese are impervious relatively to the rights trap. Now, on one hand, this might be demobilizing. There's nothing to secure them. It's hard to get people to take that risk, much like with the blue parable that I mentioned. And every iterative stage of activist work might end up being unraveled. It's very difficult to say we won for sure. I once asked a group who had done a whole flood protest, they reaped what they sowed, they re-entered their old land, laid down seed, it had grown, and they sold it on the market. And I said, victory has been achieved. And they said, well, we're not really sure. Who knows, the next season they could always come back and steal the land again. But alternatively, potential losses are often just opportunities for other improvisations. So rather than people complaining about not getting their rights, going home, getting demobilized, for activists who are pretty committed to a life of refusing the conditions that they exist within, they're constantly thinking of other ways to do things. So I kind of see them as guides to alternative futures. Activists do not, and this is consistent with my critique of the performative, immediately enact new and inevitable futures. Instead, their bodies and words initiate a potential trajectory, one that haunts the existing one and threatens to return later as a ghost or revenant. So when Sansan yelled victory has been achieved, she was paving the way for a potential victory in the future. They lay down different pathways that people could potentially take. And that's what we're seeing now in the coup, in the sense that the things that Sansan was doing and the activists I study in this book, they were laying down these protest repertoires that people are picking up now and using in a way that might actually transform the country in a really meaningful way. Thanks.
So, oh good, there's one question in the Q&A, and I'm going to start us off because I'm the moderator and I can. I just want to say to everyone who wants to read this book that they need a dictionary, and they need a very contemporary dictionary. And there's a tension to me as a reader between the highfalutin theory and very long and obscure words that aren't in dictionaries that are older than 5 years, and the actual grassroots trailing and ethnography that Eliot does. I find the tension bizarre and sometimes really troublesome to me as a reader. But so with that sort of interesting reaction to your book, because I did have strong reactions to it, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more, and I love the way you do your field work and then try to bring the after the coup into every chapter makes it so that it's extremely interesting to think about your points, and it works. Tell us more about Kodka, how you decided to use them. I'm mispronouncing his name, but the force. And tell us a little bit more about what they're doing, because that will give us a way into what's going on now.
Yeah. I mean, as with most things in anthropology, it was, I just got lucky to fall in with this group who was willing to take me along for the ride. And it's in anthropology at this particular moment in time, epistemologically, it's kind of fallen out of favor to be a sort of fly on the wall, because your presence especially as a white man in the middle of a paddy field in Burma is weird, and it does affect the situation. And I think they were very clever about how they used me, even as I was learning from them. So they knew that if I was with them, they were much less likely to be beaten and thrown back in prison. Now, it could have happened, but I think they used me as a little bit of a cover, and that's why I can kind of explain, like, why did they want you around in the first place? I think much of it wasn't just instrumental though, much of it was, kind of like solidarity, and they were interested in the fact that I was interested in what they were up to. And we had a lot to talk about and compare across cultures. And this will allow me to talk a little bit about the linguistic aspect. I want to stress that my Burmese is not where I would like it to be. And much of the conversations that I was observing took place across many different languages and registers. As an example, whenever I was in a village and asking people questions, I would formulate a question in Burmese, and my interlocutor would look at Godal or one of my other comrades and be like, "What just came out of that guy's mouth?" And then Godal or another friend would translate my Burmese into Burmese, which was always very insulting and deflating, but that's on me, not on them. But the reason why I bring this up is it allowed me to do some of the comparative linguistic work that I don't know if would have been available if I was just operating in Burmese. I don't want to be making a virtue out of a necessity or out of a failure, but I'll give you an example. At one point, Godal was talking in English, and he said, "Tonight you'll have the right to meet so on." And I thought to myself, it's a weird thing to say about a friend of ours who's not an eminent personality. It's not like he had a lot to do. It's just we didn't know if he was free or not. And I think what was going on in Godal's brain is that he was thinking in Burmese, used the Quinnier, tried to think of what was the appropriate translation of that, and came up with right when he could have chosen opportunity. And so then we talked about that, and it became a sort of interesting conversation about language itself and about this particular aspect that I was interested in. It might not have occurred if I was operating only in Burmese. It doesn't mean that I don't want to keep improving my Burmese, of course. So remind me if I'm getting at the core of your question.
So just tell us about the force.
Yes.
And you could even, so that, because many people probably haven't read the book yet, but how the force got you to understand the repertoire of contention, how it got to you to understand this, what you call the I don't know what you call it, a paradox or equilibrium between resistance and refusal.
Yeah. And
then even to the tactics and actually how you led to the esoteric side too, and the cursing.
Yeah.
And tell us about, there's a whole part of the book that Elliot describes why this cursing phenomenon is a useful practice in protests.
Yeah. So I think like partially the fact that I got to hang out and have so many conversations about it, I was able to ask about these specific political issues, but also what one does in participant observation is try to avoid asking directly about things. Where anthropologists tend to be a little bit skeptical of interviews sometimes because of the fabricated nature and the inauthentic nature of an interview, where you like sit down and ask someone to reflect on something. It doesn't mean they don't have a part, but it means what you're really hoping for is to observe other people talking to each other, observe what doesn't get said, observe what kind of activities they do that provides the sort of insight into how they think about power, how they think about their role in the country. And so because I was able to hang out with them for a long time, I got to go around in this sort of movable feast, as I describe it, from in rickety lorries, traveling up to Burma, to flop houses where, they never turned the lights off when they slept. It's like kind of an interesting approach to sleep, where it's just something that happened. And if you were tired, you slept, but there weren't like these sort of like divisions between time. And in the same way that I would go home and rest because I couldn't live like that, they never really stopped. They were in kind of constant movement, partially to avoid authorities, partially because there was just so much to do. And so spending time with them and in the rhythms of their existence, I was able to kind of theorize activism as a result.
I want to hear more about after the coup, what happened, but let's go to Eric White's. If the Burmese activists you studied are not seeking the securing of rights, what criteria do they apply when deciding whether this activism has been successful or not? What constitutes, so that's an interesting question because success is such a elusive phenomenon in the way you describe the world.
Yeah, wonderful question there. I think that kind of alluded to it a little bit at the end. that you can have successes, but you just cannot know that they're going to last. And so one never is able to rest on their laurels and say, okay, we've achieved this, but they're are constantly forced to continue to think about how to defend the brief success, to consider how the political opportunity structure, which is a term that sociologists and social movements use, to whether it changes, whether your own actions could change it and invite response in turn. So kind of anticipating what might be the next turn of the screw as the empire strikes back. And so successes are the material realizations of things that you didn't have before. So in the plow protests, getting to take the farmers getting to take their rice to market would be a success, but it was not a success that expands into an ever unfolding an eventual, necessarily, forever. It's something that can be snatched away from them just as quickly. So one needs to always think about how to defend and reproduce the successes.
And how about, are there particular issues such as environment, land, ownership, lack of government services, etc., that are more salient among those resisting than others?
One of the ways that the activists would just often differentiated themselves from what they would call Yebosi, which is the Burmese term for oil on top of the water. Those like elite activists that they didn't like were that sort of material realities that they were intervening in versus the more procedural elements of the structure of the Constitution, for instance, and rule of law movements that they kind of disdain. One point in the book, one of the characters says, we are willing to organize a plow protest and actually get land back. We are willing to, in a sort of macho register, we are willing to fight and die for the people. Those other folks, they just care about changing the Constitution. That's not really our struggle. That's something that, Aung San Suu Kyi was pursuing so she can be formally president. So that's one of the things that differentiated them. And when I was in the country, in that period of transition, just land was the biggest issue because it's this key means of production for a huge number of people in the country. And because of the weird formation of the political economy, it was becoming a sort of sometimes worth more for when people were off of it, for when they were on it. And so as a result, you had a lot of, and the one thing I didn't have a chance to talk about today is this political economy aspect, where people are kind of becoming less and less necessary for the reproduction of the political economy. So like as an example, an agribusiness that takes up a huge amount of land needs, relatively speaking, many fewer laborers. If the land that people are cultivating on sits on top of a bunch of minerals that can be sold to China, for instance, it's better to have those people off the land. And so peasants were finding themselves kind of uprooted and without a place to really re-embed in the economy. And so one of the ways they knew they could was by getting the land back. And so that was probably the most salient struggle. Colleagues of mine like Hilary Faxon and Sue Mark have books that are coming out, or in Sue's case, have come out on the land issue in particular. And for me, I have chapter 3 that's devoted to it. So it's not the only issue, but I think it was probably the lion's share of activities that I was able to participate in when I was there.
Questions in the room?
I'm not a scholar on Buddhism, but I do know something about the concept of no self.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that played into the idea of sort of projecting the concept that these are mind rights.
Yeah, wonderful. So I often think about that in the context of like what Buddhist political thought could be regarding like rights, and because one of the ideas is no self, the other idea is attachment, is a sort of defilement that one is supposed to avoid. If you're attached to your rights constituting yourself, that's almost like a betrayal of what you should be doing. On the other hand, I think people are able to hold many different ideas about things in their head at once. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that Mapida, who I mentioned at one point, she wrote a prison memoir where she talked about how meditation allowed her to get to turn away from herself so much so that the torture and the miserable conditions in prison didn't seem to affect her anymore. And I think that's really powerful, but I also kind of sometimes wonder, I asked the activists who I work with about it, and they were like, no, prison was too crazy of a place to meditate. And this is our life, this happened to us. And that they use that as a sort of resource in an interesting way, in a way that doesn't mean that Maffia's way is right or wrong. It just means that they, even operating in the Buddhist context, we're not necessarily wed to certain Buddhist ideas about the body and the self and human rights. But wonderful question.
Anybody else have a question?
I was going to ask, when you're talking about rights being like a bit more zero sum, do you think that's tied into the states that have presence absence, as in like people don't have it clear as in if, let's say, rights are to be implemented, like what they would exactly be getting, so it becomes a lot more like that.
Absolutely. I mean, like, a right is an interesting technology of describing a relationship between the governed and some sort of duty bearer that necessarily implies like duration across time and space. And if you have this present absent state, as I'm arguing, it's like it's hard to ever really secure a right. Going back to Eric's question and some of these points about when a victory can be achieved, because you don't know if the claim that you make today is going to reach its target again when it's made in the next day. So I kind of like spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, what is a right that cannot be reproduced. And I think it's more of a permission or opportunity, one that might dissolve in the next moment. And so I would completely agree with you. That's a very nice piece of analysis.
One, I'd love for you to talk about how you think the people that you know best, because you've been writing about them, are able to keep going, the ones that have stayed in the country since the coup, and how that's going, if they're thinking of success or not success.
Yeah.
And just also just to point out in your comments on the people you cover are all male, basically, except for that woman that was involved in the cloud protest. That you talk about how it was a very male phenomenon, and you think it's changed. I'd love to hear more about that. And second, that your research and your field work is very much with Bamar people, and that you don't deal with the broader, more complicated Myanmar.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So 3 questions there. The activists, as I said at the top, kind of like had to face this sort of agonizing choice: do they leave and kind of access resources that they might not have inside the country, to then maybe come back in the future, or do they stay? And what does that look like? They ultimately decided to stay and have sort of, I'm not exactly sure all the things they did during the last 2.5 years, but I know that they are working, kind of have almost gone back to some of those initial service delivery projects, working in industrial zones with workers. The worker issue is really interesting too, because, and I don't write about this in the book because it hadn't really emerged yet, but brands were like pulling out, and there's a sort of question about what is the ethical role of a brand in this particular situation. I mean, whether one can be ethical under capitalism is sort of a non-starter, but let's imagine like less unethical than otherwise. And because of the way the political economy is structured in Myanmar, you have this sort of rentier state where the state is able to extract rents from natural resource exploitation, and that severs the sort of link between the state or whoever is stealing those rents and the people, because usually in sort of like a classic dialectic between state and society, taxation becomes this mechanism in which people give resources to the state and the state delivers security. But when you have a rentier state, you don't need to tax anyone. And Myanmar has one of the lowest tax bases in the entire world for that reason. And as a result, the garment sector actually isn't really taxed at all. And so you have this interesting issue where people who don't know the details all that well are assuming, like, well, how can the brand stay? They're giving money directly to the regime. But the regime doesn't actually tax all that much. And so the workers are like, well, we're taking this money, we're using it to help support our communities and help lead the revolution. So this is sort of interesting way that the activists, by sort of like working to support the workers, are indirectly trying to support the revolution. They're also still doing that. And obviously for security reasons, don't want to say too much more about what they're doing, but they did decide to stay. The second question was about gender, right? And then the third question was,
Just to point out that it's on the
yeah,
Myanmar.
yeah. So the gender issue was a one that was fraught for the leaders of the activist group who always wanted to incorporate more women, but it was difficult given that even if they made certain arrangements for women to be able to participate, there was a sort of perception on the part of members of the community, their parents, that they were being put into a pretty vulnerable situation, and even if they like got hotel rooms for them, as opposed to everyone like sleeping in a big room in wherever they were staying, as they mostly did. There's a sort of perception that funny business could be, that there could be funny business, and so as a result, the women who were involved in the activist group tended to remain in Yangon, where they would repair to their own homes to sleep and do less of the peripatetic movement. And then during the period of the transition, because so much of the necessary work became, through some of those more formal institutions, women participated much more in that. But then now that the coup has gone on again, as the coup occurred and activism has kind of translated outside of the formal, I wouldn't say there are like few, I don't really know as much about it. I know some of the women who I knew, went to prison and were for a couple of days and then were given this sort of these sheets to say, I promise not to protest again. And they signed them and immediately went back to the protest camps. So I know that they're involved, I just don't know how deeply they're involved these days. The third question is about the very much lowland Burma study, and my colleague Kevin Woods always reminds me every time I say Burma to remind listeners that's what I mean, that I don't mean the sort of area, the upland areas that have traditionally been populated more by non-Burma ethnic nationalities, which include the Shan, the Chin, Pichin, the American. There is a chapter devoted to the Rohingya issue because it was such an enormous world historical catastrophe that I felt like it would be a disservice to their struggle and history to leave it out. And so I do mention that and try to use or tell the story of the Rohingya as a way of broadening out the understanding of this kind of larger context that is Burma in the transition period.
Anybody else want to say anything? Well, it's a particularly interesting time for you to be talking about this book because you don't know what the future holds, and maybe some of your alternative futures will come to pass.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe should I say a little bit about that?
Do.
Yeah, so in the last couple of weeks, there was this Operation 1027, so-called because it occurred on the 27th of October, in which several of the ethnic revolutionary organizations or armed organizations got together to, in a way that they hadn't before, and have overrun 120 military bases, mostly in northern Shan State. And as the regime has to redeploy resources to defend that front, PDS and other parts of the country are taking things over. So there was a lot of activity in Kayah State the other day as well. I can't remember exactly the day, but what they're calling their own 1027. That combined with some of the other ways that the resistance broadly conceived is using things like drones to kind of balance the asymmetric warfare in a way that levels the playing field a little bit. And people who know more about the sort of fighting strategy than I do are more optimistic than they have been in a while. I mean, one is always hesitant to endorse armed violence when they're not the ones, in my case, who's on the front lines and I have to bear the costs. But on the other hand, I think everyone knows what they're doing, what they're getting into, and in a space where people don't feel a whole lot of hope over the last 2.5 years, this is, more hopeful than I think people have been in a while, and I think that's something to hold on to.
And for all of us to watch. Thank you, and thank you very much for letting us have a way to interpret what happens. Okay, thank you.